7 of the most photogenic craft bourbon brands sitting on your liquor store shelf right now share one quiet little secret. The juice inside, almost all of them, rolls out of the same sprawling industrial distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, gets shipped in tanker trucks to a marketing office somewhere, and then gets dressed up in a heritage costume the actual whiskey never lived through. We're talking about the same base spirit, from the same column stills, sold to whoever signs the check. Yet you're paying craft prices, sometimes ultra-premium prices, for what is functionally bulk contract whiskey. Today, we're naming 7 brands that built their entire identity on this trick, what their juice reportedly costs in bulk, and what you're actually handing over at the register. Number 1 might be the most aggressive markup in the modern American whiskey aisle, and once you see the math, you cannot unsee it. Here's the part nobody at these brands wants printed on the front label. There is a real distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, originally Seagram, then MGP of Indiana, and now operating under the parent company Penn Pride as Ross and Squibb Distillery. Most of the industry still casually calls the juice MGP. They've been quietly supplying contract whiskey to dozens of brands you think are tiny family operations. There's a second tier of contract producers worth naming. Bardstown Bourbon Company in Kentucky runs one of the largest custom distilling programs in the country, producing bespoke mash bills for client brands. Green River Distilling in Owensboro fills the same role for brands that want a Kentucky address on the back of the bottle without owning a still. Sourcing isn't inherently a sin. Hiding it is. The word craft on a front label has no legal definition in American whiskey, which is exactly why so many marketing departments use it. That single regulatory gap explains nearly the entire pricing structure of the so-called craft segment. I poured a flight of sourced Rise Blind at my kitchen counter last winter, just glasses on a dish towel and a notebook. The aromatic signature was unmistakable across most of them. That sharp dill pickle brine top note, the snap of green herbs, the dry baking spice kick on the back of the tongue. That's the famous MGP 95% rye fingerprint. The bottles cost wildly different amounts. The juice kept telling the same story. The cheapest pour ran around $26, the most expensive cleared $120, and the blind tasting could not consistently rank them. One quick math note before the countdown. Younger contract bourbon and rye, 2 to 4 years old, has reportedly traded among non-distilling producers in a range that lands somewhere between $3 and $8 of liquid per finished bottle. Older contract stocks climb. But even higher-end contract barrels rarely justify a $40, $60, or $100 shelf premium. The gap between bulk cost and shelf price is where the marketing budget lives. Number 7 is Templeton Rye. The marketing built an entire universe around a Prohibition-era Iowa recipe, Al Capone's supposed favorite, a small Midwestern town reviving its bootleg legacy. The bottle leans into that mythology hard. For years, the actual liquid was distilled in Indiana at MGP, then trucked to Iowa, where the brand finished and bottled it. That fact only became widely known after a 2014 class action settlement forced Templeton to change its labels and quietly admit the sourcing publicly. They've since invested in their own Iowa distillery and have started producing some of their own juice, which is a fair correction. For over a decade, the price tag asked you to pay for a Capone story, while the liquid was rolling in from a contract column still 9 hours away, at roughly $30 to $35 a bottle, with a 40% ABV expression, and chill filtering on the standard line. You're paying for a screenplay, not a stillhouse. The post-lawsuit Templeton is more honest, but the brand still trades on a backstory the bottle in your hand never personally experienced. Pour it neat, and you'll find a thin mid-palate, and a finish that disappears before you can describe it. The current liquid is pleasant enough, but ordinary. The cost-to-honesty ratio is the real lesson. The finishing earns a small portion of the markup. The Capone mythology earns the rest. Number 6 is redemption. The whole presentation reads independent craft. Stripped down label, monk-like minimalism, a single word as the brand identity, and that high rye bourbon, straight rye, wheated rye lineup that whiskey nerds devour. What the marketing soft pedals is that redemption is a sourced brand bottling MGP distilled juice. They've been transparent in some interviews, less transparent on the front label. Redemption is now owned by Deutsche Family Wine and Spirits, the same importer-distributor empire behind Josh Seller's Wine and Yellowtail's American distribution. So you're not buying from a quiet, rural distiller. You're buying contract whiskey marketed by a wine importer. The standard Redemption High Rye Bourbon runs roughly $28 to $35 at 42% ABV. The rye is similar money. The barrel-proof expressions push past $60 and $40, with the bonded versions creeping into the 50s. At 50% ABV on the bonded line, the specs themselves are fine. The label invokes a name from the early American Republic. The juice in older bottles came from a column still that started running long after most of those founding family distillers were forgotten. Better now, worth knowing, if you want to support the heritage. Story honestly, look for newer releases that explicitly note Lexington distillation. The transition is real but still incomplete. Number 4 is Smooth Ambler. The West Virginia operation made its name on the Old Scout line, which was openly a sourced bourbon program, much of it from MGP. The brand actually deserves credit for being more upfront than most of its peers. They printed sourcing details on labels, talked openly about it in interviews, and built genuine respect among enthusiasts for honesty. So why are they on this list? Because Smooth Ambler is now owned by Pernod Ricard, the French spirits giant behind Jameson, Absolut, Chivas, and dozens of other brands. The acquisition reportedly closed in 2016. Old Scout Bourbon and Rye still command between $40 and $60, with the older single-barrel expressions pushing well past that. Does the Smooth Ambler bottle on the shelf today reflect the small shop transparency that built the brand, or is it a portfolio asset under one of the largest spirits companies on earth? The cask-strength Old Scout still pours with that warm, baked cornbread sweetness, a flicker of clove on the back palate, and a long, satisfying glow that lingers after the swallow. The Old Scout sourcing arrangement, however, has continued to anchor the most visible expressions on the shelf. The honesty earns part of the markup. The conglomerate ownership consumes the rest. Number 3 is Bulleit Rye. The frontier whiskey marketing is everything. Apothecary bottle, embossed font, that stagecoach trail aesthetic. The founder narrative reaching back to a Bulleit ancestor in 1830s Kentucky. It is one of the most successful pieces of whiskey theater in the American market. For over a decade, Bulleit Rye was reportedly distilled at MGP in Indiana under contract for Diageo, the global spirits giant that owns Bulleit. The 95% rye, 5% malted barley mash bill is the famous MGP signature recipe. Diageo eventually opened its own Bulleit Distilling Company facility in Shelbyville, Kentucky, but Bulleit Rye specifically has continued to lean on sourced juice for years after that opening, with publicly disclosed transitions happening gradually. The standard Bulleit Rye runs roughly $27 to $33 at 45% ABV, which on its own is a fair price for a competent rye. The deception isn't the dollar amount, it's the marketing. You're being sold frontier Kentucky family distillery imagery for a liquid that was contract distilled in Indiana for a multinational corporation headquartered in London. The taste profile itself is genuinely useful in cocktails. Bright dill on the nose, a snap of green pepper at the front, peppermint, and toasted rye bread mid-palate, a clean dry finish that sits well in a Manhattan or a Sazerac. The proofing earns a thin sliver of the premium. The frontier costume earns the rest. Now we shift from the volume players to the high-end markup tier, where the gap between what the juice cost and what you're paying gets genuinely uncomfortable. The next 2 brands aren't necessarily worse whiskey than what we just covered. They're charging considerably more for the same fundamental sourcing trick. Number 2 is Angel's Envy Rye. The brand is owned by Bacardi, after Bacardi reportedly acquired it in 2015. Angel's Envy makes a port-finished bourbon at its own Louisville distillery now, and that bourbon is honestly distilled there. The rye is the suspicious one. Angel's Envy Rye has long been a sourced rye finished in rum casks with the rye reportedly distilled at MGP. The price point is the part that should make you stop. Angel's Envy Rye sits between $200 and $250 per bottle in many US markets when you can find it, and it goes considerably higher on secondary. For finished sourced juice, the rum cask finishing does add genuine character. Caribbean spice, dried tropical fruit, a softer landing on the back palate. That work has real value. But $250 for a finishing program built on contract rye is a pricing decision that asks you to accept the brand's premium positioning as fact. You're paying overwhelmingly for the cask program, the Bacardi distribution muscle, and the bottle's reputation. Not for distillery work, the brand itself performed on the base spirit. Consider what $250 buys elsewhere. You can stack 3 bottles of Russell's Reserve Single Barrel Rye, a true wild turkey distilled product, and still have change for a sandwich. You can pick up a Pikesville Straight Rye, a Heaven Hill distilled 6-year, 4 times over. The brand trades on Louisville address and a finishing program. Both are real. Neither, in my view, costs what the bottle asks. The finishing earns maybe $40 of markup. The bottle asks for $200 more. Number 1 is High West, and this is the brand that probably popularized the contemporary sourced whiskey craft brand category more than any other name on this list. Founded in Park City, Utah, the brand built a passionate following on whimsically named blends like Rendezvous Rye, Double Rye, Campfire, and the now mythic A Midwinter Nights Dram. The marketing leans on Utah saloon imagery, mountain craftsmanship, and tasting room storytelling. For most of its history, the rye in those bottles came predominantly from MGP in Indiana, blended with smaller amounts of other sourced and eventually some house-made stock. High West has been more transparent than most peers, openly discussing its blending philosophy in interviews and publications. The Park City and One Ship facilities do produce some in-house spirit, though the famous core ryes still lean heavily on contract MGP stock. Constellation Brands, the giant beer wine spirits conglomerate, reportedly acquired High West in 2016 for around $160 million. So the small Utah saloon feeling? That's owned by the same parent company behind Modelo, Corona's US arm, Robert Mondavi Wine, and Svedka Vodka. Now to the price disconnect. Rendezvous Rye sits around $60 to $70, Double Rye around $40, Bury around $80 to $90. A Midwinter Nights Dram routinely retails around $130 at MSRP and easily clears $300 or $400 on secondary. For a finished blend built largely on contract MGP rye, those numbers ask you to value the blending work and brand storytelling at the same level as actual ground-up distillery craftsmanship. The blending is genuinely skilled. The Midwinter Cask program is genuinely interesting. But when a sourced and finished blend trades at $300 on the back of saloon imagery and a stuffed bear in the visitor center, you're not paying for the spirit. You're paying for the most successful piece of brand architecture in modern American whiskey, layered on top of contract juice from a column still in Indiana. That, in my assessment, is the most aggressive markup on sourced bourbon category whiskey in the current market. The aroma profile is gorgeous, all baked stone fruit and warm brown spice. But the underlying liquid started its life in the same Lawrenceburg column stills, feeding the $30 bottles further down this list. The blending deserves enthusiastic respect at MSRP, and considerable skepticism at flipper prices. A quick word on names you might have expected to see. Whistlepig spent its early years bottling sourced Canadian rye, primarily from Alberta distillers, not MGP. The brand has since invested heavily in its own Vermont distilling operation, and recent expressions reflect more of that work, though sourcing still reportedly plays a role in some bottles. Belle Meade is owned by Nelson's Greenbrier and was a long-running, sourced MGP bourbon program with Tennessee finishing, with the brand transitioning toward more in-house distillation over time. These deserve a footnote rather than a top spot because the trajectory has been moving in the right direction. Willett distills its own juice now, after years as a non-distilling producer. Michter's has used a mix of sourced and in-house production depending on the expression. The category is messy. The honest brands tell you where they currently stand. The dishonest ones let you assume. Here's the part the industry really doesn't want centered. The whole sourced juice ecosystem exists because the math works for everyone except the consumer. A non-distilling producer, called an NDP in industry shorthand, can launch a brand with no still, no warehouse, and almost no capital expenditure. Buy a tanker of contract whiskey. Pay a co-packer to bottle it. Build a website with sepia photos of a man in suspenders. Run paid social. Within 18 months, you have a national brand selling at premium prices. The actual aging, the actual fermentation, the actual investment in equipment and time, done by a contract distillery that gets paid wholesale and gets none of the brand premium. The brand owner captures the markup. You fund the markup. Federal labeling rules let a brand print almost anything, as long as the state of distillation appears on the back label. That state is the only piece of legally protected truth on most sourced bottles. Most consumers never read the back. They read the front. They read the story. They pay accordingly. So what do you actually do with this at the register? Here is the practical shelf test. 15 seconds. First, flip the bottle around and find the small print near the bottom of the back label. Look for the words distilled in. If it says distilled in Indiana, you are almost certainly holding MGP/Ross and Squibb juice. If it says distilled in Kentucky, but the brand name and address point somewhere else entirely, you are likely looking at contract production from Bardstown Bourbon Company, Green River, or another Kentucky contract producer. Second, watch for the phrase produced by versus distilled by. Produced by usually means the company on the front did not distill the spirit. Distilled by means they did. The two phrases are deliberately written to look interchangeable. They are not. Third, be skeptical of any front label that uses craft, small batch, or handcrafted without a verifiable distillery address that matches the brand name. Fourth, ask the staff. A clerk who knows the category will tell you in seconds which brands on the shelf are sourced. Fifth, sourcing isn't automatic disqualification. The problem is the gap between what the bottle suggests and what the bottle is. When a brand charges craft prices while burying its sourcing in fine print, that's a markup on storytelling. Sixth, treat heritage dates with skepticism. A founding date of 1812 on a relaunched brand tells you about the lawyer who registered the trademark, not about the still that filled your bottle. I'll close with this. The juice that comes out of the Indiana operation in Lawrenceburg, whether you call it MGP or Ross and Squibb, is genuinely competent whiskey. There's no shame in being made there. The shame is in being made there while the bottle in your hand pretends otherwise. Heritage labels selling industrial output as artisanal craft is the oldest trick in modern American whiskey, and it's quietly become the dominant business model in the so-called craft segment. The next time you reach for a bottle dressed in saloon imagery, frontier fonts, or some founder's great-great-grandfather's recipe, flip it around and read the back label slowly. Look for the words distilled by, not bottled by, not produced by. Those phrases are deliberately written to sound the same and mean very different things. You deserve to know what you're buying. Now you do. Spend accordingly.